In trying to put together tonight's panel, I wanted to provide you with a range of experts, from those who have been fighting the battle for the last 40 or 50 years to those who have just joined the struggle to provide equal educational opportunity, and against that backdrop, talk about how America has changed over the last 40 or 50 years since Brown versus Board of Education was rendered by the Supreme Court. I tried to think of someone who could respond to some of these issues and give us a way of talking about them within the context of modern urban politics. Because it's not enough for us to identify a problem, we also have to figure out how to solve it politically given our current political situation in cities and in the nation. The person that came to mind was J. Philip Thompson, an associate professor of urban politics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in Boston, a state that just elected its first black governor ever. Someone we know, Duval Patrick, another civil rights attorney, I'm happy to say. There's hope, there's hope. Phil Thompson is an urban planner and a political scientist. He's also part of the CUNY family, which was another reason he was the perfect choice to join us tonight. After receiving his BA in sociology from Harvard, I mean, that's okay, he then came to New York to Hunter College for his master's and his PhD in political science from the City University of New York Graduate Center. He's worked as Deputy General Manager of the New York Housing Authority and as Director of the Mayor's Office of Housing Coordination, and has served as a frequent advisor to trade unions and other institutions on how to work with immigrants and community groups around this nation. His most recent academic work includes a 2004 review of public health interventions in poor black communities. He's also written a book, a very important book, called Double Trouble, Black Mayors, Black Communities, and the Struggle for Deep Democracy, that was published by Oxford University Press earlier this year. A noted expert on issues of race and community development, he has been an advisor to many groups trying to recover from Hurricane Katrina. Against that wonderful backdrop, we invite you to the stage.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here. I love CUNY. I love New York. My old boss is here, Barbara Fife. It's great to see her. I worked for her in city government. Also, I had no idea Ackerman was associated with Marion, and I met her when she was like a young lawyer and PhD candidate at Yale, I believe, Princeton, I'm sorry, in African American history. And this has been a long time. And the reason I mentioned that was, and it burned in my head, my wife is a civil rights attorney also. I had never met a white African-American major in anything. Marion was the very first. And I was like, I was trying to see, is she black? I mean, I was trying to look, I was trying to figure it out, but, Marion does great work, and it's really, I now understand, where she came from. I can't help but say something about Mr. Polikoff's provocative presentation, only because I'm so troubled and have been for so long about these very issues. And one of my feelings about ghettos, having grown up in one, and then working in the housing authority in New York and so on, I have always felt that the cause of ghettos were not internal to the ghettos themselves. And one of the meaning that I've always felt like if you take a lot of black folks from the ghetto, central Brooklyn, it's okay if you take a few. But if you take a bunch of them and move them to Yonkers or move them to the suburbs, the white people are going to move to the country. And then if you take the black people and move them to the country, the white people are going to move back in the city. And that the real problem of the ghetto actually has something to do with white people. And they don't want to be around black people. And that until we got to that, we wouldn't be able to end ghettos. Because I thought it has something to do with white people, not primarily black people. That's how I felt about it. In slightly more academic terms, ghettos have been conceptualized by Charles Hamilton in the 60s, by Bill Tabb, who's an economist at the CUNY, as internal colonies. And I actually and also by Kenneth Clark at one point, called them internal colonies. And I think there is some advantage to thinking about ghettos in those terms, because it forces one to think about what role do ghettos play in society or in the economy or in the system of government that we have in this country, which forces one to think a little more systematically about why they're there. Manning Marable wrote a book published in 1984, in which he said that ghettos have historically been holding places for cheap labor. And that labor has been black very often. And that with deindustrialization, he predicted, this is in the early 80s when he wrote this, they will become increasingly marginal. Therefore, he's predicted, based on a theory of what ghettos were, that we'll see just blacks become heavily incarcerated, heavily oppressed. He said it will be genocidal, perhaps. What will happen? Because their traditional role has been eroded. Now, one needn't agree with that, but one thing I appreciated about it, it's a theory about why they're there. And I think it's important to bear that in mind, because I believe that ghettos do play a role in our economy historically and continue to do so. And I think our economy historically has relied on cheap labor without political rights, which what segregation was and slavery was. It was a labor system. It wasn't just an outburst of racial hatred. It had something to do with wealth creation and how this country became so rich. And this country has a hard time functioning without cheap labor with no political rights, which is why we encourage so many immigrants to come into this country illegally. Companies send recruiters to South America to bring cheap workers here. We are addicted to our nanny who cleans the floor and takes care of the baby and does the laundry for nothing, and who can't vote. And so we have tens of millions of people in this country who functionally are the same as black people were in the Old South. They're doing slave labor with no rights, can't vote. They're not here by accident. Anyway, that's not what I was going to talk about, but I just think it's important to keep pressing and to, I think these are real important points, to keep pressing and to think about these issues. I was going to ask the question, should fighting for civil rights be the focus of efforts to improve the lives of African Americans? And I pose this, I'm like the son of civil rights activists. I'm the husband of a civil rights attorney. I'm raising this question. I've spent a big part of my life, most of my life, fighting around these kinds of issues. I nonetheless raise this question. Should civil rights be the focus of efforts to improve the lives of African Americans? Why do I ask this? Well, I really was struck when the NAACP gave Condi Rice the Citizen of the Year award a few years ago. That made me think real deeply. Where is this civil rights thing now? Seriously. But I've been thinking about it actually a lot longer than that. And by civil rights, I mean the things we've been working around: housing desegregation, voting rights, equal treatment under the criminal justice system, anti-discrimination in employment, affirmative action in higher education and government contracts. I think a focus on fighting around these issues as the primary way in which we address how do we improve the lives of poor people and African Americans in this country, African Americans in particular. I think these fights are necessary, but I don't think they're sufficient, nor do I think they're the critical cutting edge of what we need to focus on at this time. And I say this for two reasons. One, African Americans lack the resources and capacity to make use of the rights they possess already. That's number one. Number two, much of black people's life fortunes, and particularly the poor, but not just the poor, are shaped by economic forces that are increasingly independent of government control. And the issue here is less about rights than about raw economic power. And I want to say a little bit about both of those things, then I'll try and close. First, on blacks' lack of resources and capacity to make use of rights. Having the right to buy a house in a white neighborhood doesn't mean that one can afford to do so, that black people can afford to do so. I'm the son of a black preacher from Virginia, who also worked in the Pennsylvania Railroad his entire career. And when you worked in the railroad, your money, if you were black, all the workers, black and white, their money was docked, and a portion of their money went to the pension fund. However, only union members got pensions, and if you weren't in the union, couldn't get a pension. And so, after working in the railroad for most of his adult life, my father sued to get into the union. He was the first black admitted into the Pennsylvania Railroad Workers Union through a struggle, and then he died 2 years later. So my mother's pension is just for 2 years worth of work. It's nothing. But I'm not saying feel sorry for my mother or whatever. He got in. The rest of the black workers, they didn't get in until later. And all of these black folks worked their careers, and they did not get pensions. I say this to say that you have a generation of black middle-class people now, middle-aged and middle-class. We are the fruit of the civil rights. If there was a great, fruit product, coming out of the civil rights movement, it's supposed to be the black middle class, right, that exists today. And that was a great accomplishment, of course. But I want to say something about the black middle class. I'm part of it. My age, most of the folks I know, their parents don't have a pension. If they do, it's very little. And they really don't have health coverage for their elderly years. And so you have a lot of black middle class people who are caring for their elders. You're not going to sit and watch your parents suffer and not do everything you can to make sure they can get some kind of medical care, their rent is paid, they got some clothes, to go to church that look all right. You're going to do everything you can to take care of them. And that's what's going on with the black middle class. Then you got kids. And you know what's going on with schools. The ghetto schools. You're trying to get them into a good school, either a private school or into a white neighborhood or an upper middle, some kind of neighborhood where they'll get an education. That costs a lot of money. You either have to buy a house or you have to pay for private school. So you have the middle class, black middle class, that is now being pulled, stretched by elder care, and then really struggling to try and raise their kids. And the data on black kids, the children of the black middle class right now indicate that they're not doing as well as their parents did. So, it's a real struggle. Then Michael Dawson, University of Chicago, political scientist, comes out with these studies. The black middle class is the most angry group in the black community right now. 15 years ago, 25% of them believed that blacks ought to leave the Democratic Party and form a black party. Today, it's over 50%. They are furious. The most angry section. Why? Because they were supposed to be the ones who like made it. And the black middle class is inheriting debt from their parents. The white middle class right now is in the process of inheriting at least $5 trillion from their parents, largely as a result of housing segregation and post-World War II policies and all of that. But blacks didn't get into the neighborhoods where houses appreciated in value and this and that. They're not getting inheritance. Which that means is, at a practical level, you have a lot of black middle class people. I talk with friends about this all the time. We're trying to buy houses in white neighborhoods, and we're like working with our white colleagues who are buying these houses. And we're like, we know what they make. You know, we know, how can they afford this? I mean, how? And the answer is they got an inheritance. Oh, you know? And so as a result of historical racism, there is a widening gap now. And housing affordability, which means that even if one has a right to move into a white neighborhood, I live in Brookline, which is like Jewish left. I went to a big Halloween party a few years ago, and there were Jews for Al Sharpton fighting the Jews for Kosinich. And I was like, where am I? You know? I mean, these folks love having black neighbors. Everybody comes over, oh, we're so happy you're here. You have dinner. I mean, they're just happy, happy, happy. But it is like a white neighborhood. Why black people can't afford to move in there? I mean, and, you know, my wife is one of those rare black people who got an inheritance, you know? But, you know, the point is, simply addressing issues of discrimination won't necessarily bring about racial integration, and we have to look at economics. We have to look at the capacity to take advantage of these opportunities when they exist. Having the right to vote has not provided blacks with the resources or capacity to influence the thinking of the white majority in any profound way in this country. The United States is still a majority white voting country, and we are a very strong majority rule country, and that majority rule provisions are predominant in allocating political power. I mean, you know, winner take all. That's the system we have. Meaning that having Charlie Rangel in Ways and Means doesn't necessarily mean that Charlie Rangel has, you know, convinced the rest of Congress that they ought to end poverty in ghettos. That's not the way it works. And black people don't finance the campaigns of important black candidates. Generally, they go elsewhere for their money. Having the right to free speech doesn't mean blacks can afford to buy television networks or newspapers. The Boston Globe is up for sale right now. New York Times paid $1.5 billion for it. There's a fire sale right now. It's only $900 million. Okay, you don't see any black investors lined up to buy the Boston Globe to give blacks a voice. You see Jack Welch, who's lined up, and the LA Times is up for sales now. You have a number of billionaires who are fighting with each other to see who's going to own the LA Times. Having the right to free speech doesn't mean you actually have a voice on the media, is my point. Many cities have all black criminal justice systems and are locking up poor blacks in large numbers. And the problem here is not just about racism in the criminal justice system, it's about deep-rooted unemployment, which leads so many young people to resort to drug dealing and then killing each other over defending turf. So I say all this to say, having rights doesn't necessarily mean that you can use them. And right now, African Americans lack resources and capacity to even hold black elected officials accountable, to even use the media to argue with whites on issues of ghetto and poverty and causation and all of that, in order to even move into neighborhoods that have decent schools, even when the white people want you to move in. There are these obstacles that are there. Second, to elaborate on the economy, The Black civil rights movement's core belief was that anti-discrimination law and advocacy would allow blacks to enter the mainstream. The mainstream was where the American dream actually applied. If you work hard, study, and play by the rules, you will succeed. It's almost like an automatic process, the way it's theorized. However, we need to be clear. The American dream is not automatic. It's a myth grounded in post-World War II economic prosperity and American economic dominance in manufacturing during that period of time. As William Julius Wilson has shown, the foundation of that myth began to dissipate in the 1960s before blacks even got a strong foothold in industry. Nowadays, if you work hard, study, and graduate high school, there is no guarantee that you'll get a living wage job. In fact, the wages of engineers and architects, I know this, I'm at MIT, are being driven down by well-educated engineers and architects located in India and China. And doctors may be next, by the way. Radiologists and others may be next. So this is true for whites and blacks. But there's not an automatic link anymore between playing by the rules, working hard, saving, and then you'll get a good job. Rather than a continuing focus narrowly on anti-discrimination, I think that blacks need to focus on accumulating raw economic power and on building alliances with labor unions and others concerned with the economic future of workers and poor people in this country. If blacks do this, then perhaps they can afford to own newspapers, finance political campaigns of candidates who espouse their agenda, and make meaningful use of civil rights. For example, labor pension fund investments in the United States total $7 trillion, 28% of all stock on Wall Street, but they rarely manage their own money. A small example is a fund created by building trades in the AFL-CIO called HITBIT, Housing Investment Trust, Building Investment Trust. And I've been working in New Orleans for the last year. And we invited black labor leaders, heads of labor locals, to come to New Orleans, a dozen of them. They went around, they were just decimated by what they saw. They went back and they raised hell to their union presidents and some local white construction unions, small ones, in New Orleans did the same thing. And as a result, last June, the HITBIT held a press conference with Mayor Nagin, and they pledged $1.2 billion of investment in New Orleans, which is by far the single largest private investment by far in New Orleans, and they did it at a time when other financial houses were scared to go near it. And they're getting their money out on the street before the federal government is. And they're there now. This is but just the tip of the iceberg of what could happen with a clear focus on harnessing the collective economic power of blacks and other poor people. For example, and another example, Billy Thompson, I used to work for him, is the New York City comptroller. He invests billions of dollars of workers' pension funds, people who work for the city of New York, billions and billions of dollars. He is the sole decision maker on where that money gets invested. He is an African American, if you don't know. He's from Brooklyn, elected by a strong black vote and strong labor support. I want to ask, what is the agenda the black community gave to Billy Thompson when he assumed that office? Did they say, invest in daycare centers? There's a shortage of quality daycare space in New York. You won't lose money building quality daycare space in New York. Did they say, use pension funds to build daycare centers? No. The answer was that there was no agenda for Billy Thompson. He said, elect me because I'm black. And that's what it's come to mean. Don't vote for the white guy, vote for me, I'm black. And that's not good enough. That's my point. The answer, the same, by the way, happened with Carl McCall when he was the state comptroller. And Carl actually complained about it. He said, why do black politicians come for me and ask me to fix a street light on 126th Street? They don't come with an agenda. And I'm sitting up here with this mountain of money. And other people are coming with agendas constantly. I think black assets are not leveraged. Finally, when we collect data about black communities, we never assess blacks' collective wealth, How much do residents of Central Brooklyn have invested in insurance companies, and in which insurance companies? How much do Central Brooklyn residents have in pension funds? Do we maximize our influence on managers of our money? What would we like to see our money invested in? Are there competent insurance companies and pension managers who share our values? And shouldn't our communities be organized around their assets, financial, as well as their votes? I think the black community cannot achieve political equality or civic justice without harnessing the economic power. And the last thing I want to say is in New Orleans, the labor is there, they've invested $1 billion, and they're trying to build an alliance with community groups to figure out how to spend it, what kind of projects to create, and that's when you see the real limitations. These community development corporations are scared of working with unions because the foundations they work with don't like unions, and HUD told them, we don't like union labor. And so they're scared of working with the labor unions. Also, none of them have a vision of what a just city looks like. There have been 4 planning efforts in New Orleans. All of them are around building houses. That's fine, but if people don't have decent jobs, and the average reading level functionally for a young black New Orleans resident, male, is 4th grade. 4th grade. So no one hires them. No one hires them. Unless you have a plan for dealing with that, no matter what kind of housing you build or how much you mix it or where you put it, they're dealing drugs. There's really nothing else there. So the idea of putting together a vision, which is possible now with an alliance of labor, black, white, Latino, united, of how to build a just city and then putting your investments behind it, your own, it's there, but it doesn't exist in people's head. It's something we have to create, and I think that's where power lies.
Well, we are turning to our final speaker, and we want to make sure we have time to engage in dialogue with you. So instead of a set piece, I'm asking our last speaker to respond to some of the issues you've heard, but also from the standpoint of where you think race relations are today. Our last speaker is Anurima Bhargava from the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund. Anytime I have an opportunity to involve LDF in the work here, I like to do so, not only because of their historic role in promoting civil rights and civil liberties for all Americans, but because of the work they're doing right now today. Anurima has been engaged in education litigation and advocacy with a focus on voluntary integration and affirmative action. And some of you may recall that Michigan just voted against affirmative action as part of the initiative process that has been used to counteract the few Supreme Court cases that have been positive on the issue of affirmative action. Which of course makes her work very interesting, but also very important. For the past several months, Ms. Bhargava has been deeply involved in the litigation, advocacy, and public education efforts in 2 of these voluntary integration cases, one in Seattle and another in Jefferson County. If you want to talk about those, I invite you to do so, but as I said, it's to get your perspective on where we are as a nation concerning civil rights today and moving forward into the future, especially when we look at efforts like Proposition 209 and the Michigan Initiative and others to restrict civil rights remedies. Prior to joining LDF, she worked as a staff attorney at the New York City Department of Education and served as a law clerk to U.S. District Judge Richard Berman of the Southern District of New York. She received her law degree from Columbia Law School here in New York, where she was the notes editor for the Columbia Law Review, and graduated magna cum laude from Harvard College with a degree in government. Anurima?
Good evening. It is really an honor to be here, and I want to start by thanking the Ackerman family, and in particular for thanking them for raising a daughter, Marian Engelman Lotto, who has been a role model for me, and her warmth and compassion in welcoming me into the civil rights community. She's a former LDF lawyer and has really been one of the people in New York who I have strived to follow. I also want to thank Alex Polikoff for the following, which is that sometimes my parents, I grew up in Chicago on the South Side. I'm a graduate of the Chicago Public Schools, and sometimes my parents wonder what it is that I do with my days. And this morning, when I told them that I'd be sharing a podium with Alex Polikoff, I think they might have thought for once that I was doing something worthwhile. So I'd like to thank him for that as well. I have been with the Legal Defense Fund for the last couple of years, and as Professor Jarvis mentioned, the Legal Defense Fund has been working for 66 years to litigate on behalf of African Americans in America, and in particular has been deeply involved in efforts to integrate America and the nation's public schools from the time of Brown. And I stand here sort of 2 years after Brown, working on cases before the Supreme Court out of Jefferson County, Kentucky, and Seattle, Washington, which may well be the end of Brown. And I don't want to start with those. I actually want to end with them and try to spend my time adding, unfortunately, some more statistics and information about the degree to which there is segregation in the American educational system. I will actually start with a statistic about educational attainment, and I hear you about economic power, but in my view, education is the sort of backbone to that. And I think in so many ways, the fact that we in this country, if you are African American and you're 25 years of age or older, you are more likely to be without a high school diploma today than you are to have a college degree. If you are white and over the age of 25 years, you are nearly 3 times as likely to have a college degree than you are to be without a high school diploma. And if there's any question about whether you have a high school diploma, if you'll be able to get a job, I'll tell you that the difference today between having a high school diploma and having a college degree is $1 million in lifetime earnings. It is $2.1 million in lifetime earnings if you don't have a high school diploma. So it is a vast disparity in terms of what our earning power, what our ability is to live and work and succeed in America when we are no longer able to have the kind of educational opportunities to both graduate from high school and to attend college. And right now, the high school graduation rate amongst African Americans hovers around 50% in the nation. And the degree to which people actually attend and then graduate from college amongst the African American community is somewhere around 40%. So I'll tell you that we are not getting anywhere close to being able to actually educate people at a college level. The reason why I want to start with some of the inequalities in education is because I think it's important to understand the landscape, and I think people are often shocked at some of these statistics. In New York City, and I actually want to focus on New York City and not Chicago, my hometown, because I think we've already had a good amount of information about what's going on in Chicago. But in New York City today, the graduation rate from high school is 30.1% of Latino students and 32.2% of Black students in 4 years. So we're only graduating 1/3 of the students who are starting. And in 2 of New York City's largest high schools, where the overwhelming majority of students are Black and Hispanic, where 98% of students are Black and Hispanic, which is not something that's actually all that unusual. We are talking about a system in New York where it's 70.1% Black and Hispanic, but many, many students go to schools that are overwhelmingly, meaning over 90% Black and Hispanic, and we're talking about 1/3 of students in New York and close to that nationwide. In those types of schools, there are many students, an overwhelming majority of students, who don't pass a single one of the state's Regents tests required for graduation, which explains, at least in part, why we have a 30% graduation rate. This is not to say that, this is not all due to the degree of segregation in New York City schools, but I think that it's incredibly important to understand the relationship between segregation and the continued segregation in schools and the dropout rates that we're seeing. New York City today is the 6th most segregated city in the nation for black students. The average black student in New York will attend a school that is 60.8% black. New York City is the 3rd most segregated city in the nation for Hispanic and Asian students. So, and that's not to say also that white students are going to schools that are racially isolated. I mean, the white students in the country as a whole go to more racially isolated schools than black, Hispanic, and Asian students combined. Here in New York, an example is Tottenville High School in Staten Island is 81.8% white. PS6 on the Upper East Side is 77% white, and we have schools in the Bronx that are 99% Dominican. So we're looking at racial isolation on all levels. The degree of racial isolation is something that has great impact on the types of schooling and experience that students have. The Civil Rights Project at Harvard, who has done probably the most research in recent years on this question, can talk about the segregation trends. We are looking today at a nation that is more segregated in terms of where students are going to school than it was in 1970. And since 1986, virtually all the school districts are showing lower levels of sort of interracial exposure, meaning contact with other racial groups, now than they were 20 years ago. The patterns of segregation are strongly linked to segregation by poverty. So we're talking again about the American and racialized ghetto, and poverty concentrations are strongly linked to unequal opportunities and unequal outcomes. High poverty schools, as you might expect, are associated with low parental involvement, lack of resources, less experienced and credentialed teachers, and higher teacher turnover. There is no question also about the educational benefits that come with integrated schools. While there's been a lot of research done in the last 52 years about the impact of integration on achievement of students, there is no question, and I think the 2003 Michigan cases out of the Grutter and Gratz cases talked a lot about how integrated classrooms prepare students for a pluralistic society that we now live in. It is an overwhelming and refreshing experience to come to this college campus and see the kind of integration that's going on, and not only in the audience today, but in the school as a whole. I think it is reflective of what New York City looks like and is an anomaly in most of America today. The resegregation that's going on is largely going on in the American South, and where the high school graduation rates mirror that of what's going on in New York City in terms of anywhere between 40 to 50% of African American students. But they're also the places where we have struggled mightily for the last 50 years to try to desegregate. And I want to speak a little bit about the Legal Defense Fund's efforts and then to these cases, and then I want to stop because I know we're well over time. There have been, as many of you know, efforts to use the courts to desegregate schools in the American South and elsewhere. And there hasn't been a court order to desegregate in the last 10 years. In fact, what we've seen is the termination of most of the court orders to desegregate schools. So if you think about Brown being the beginning of the era of court order desegregation and busing and all these things that you hear about as part of the civil rights movement, there has really been an end to that. And with that has come this massive resegregation of schools, and school districts, understanding the importance of integrating schools, have tried to actually voluntarily do what they used to be actually required to do. The cases before the Supreme Court that are going to be argued in December, on December 4th, posed a question of whether or not school districts can take voluntary measures to integrate their schools. And if the court rules that, if the court rules that school districts would be prohibited from doing that, it'd essentially be saying, you can't do what we 5 years ago required you to do. In the case of Louisville, Kentucky, it was under court order until 2000 to desegregate its schools, and now they couldn't do, and they can't take any, they would be no longer able to take any efforts to integrate their schools. And I think that that would be a reversal, clearly, of historic proportions. And I really hope that, that you are all familiar with these cases, or you get familiar with these cases, because in many ways they will change the landscape of what our schools look like, and because our schools have so much to do with where we live, where we work, how we actually interact in American society, there's a clear correlation with how comfortable people are with people of other races, and whether or not they're going to send their kids to go to school with students of other races, whether or not they're going to live in communities with people of other races. And if we can't start at the time of when we're actually formulating our views of people of other backgrounds, if we can't start in the classroom at an early age, if we're prohibited from doing that in a nation which is so incredibly segregated in terms of where people live, we can't afford to have our schools be equally as segregated. In fact, we can't have our neighborhoods in the next, over our next generation continue to be as segregated. So this case, which would basically leave, these two cases, which would basically leave American neighborhoods to basically say that you would only be able to go to school where you live, would really turn the tide on integration in America, and would get us to a place where I and I think pretty much everyone who's actually looked at looked at what will the impact be, we will be looking at schools that are much more segregated than they were in the time of Brown. And I think that it is a sad state in a multiracial and continually growing diverse country that we will get to that point in terms of what our schools look like. I want to actually stop there, and the reason is because I think that it would be much more fun to actually have some dialogue about these questions. And there's a couple things I want to commend to you to look at. There is a number of resources on our website, which is www.naacpldf.org, about these cases and about the achievement gap in America. And the reason I mention the achievement gap is because everyone, including our current president, will agree that, and this is a quote from him, until we close the achievement gap, we still have more work to do. Well, we have a lot of work to do, and I hope that, in the next couple of years, we can turn back to the priorities that of education and other, other domestic priorities that are so clearly been neglected in the last couple of years, and that through these cases we can turn national attention to the issues of what's really going on for Black students in America's schools. As Professor Jarvis mentioned yesterday or 2 days ago, Michigan passed Proposition 202, which is an anti-affirmative action ballot measure. It is an end run around Grutter and Gratz, and the commitment that the University of Michigan and the state of Michigan has made to trying to have a diverse student body at Michigan, to diversify and ensure that there is equal educational opportunity, but also equal opportunity for people to join in businesses around Michigan. It is a dramatic reversal from that. It passed by a 58-42 margin, which is surprising, I would say, but also very worrisome. I entirely expect that it will hearken a sort of nationwide movement to have such ballot measures put on state ballots all over the country. It is part of a movement that started with Proposition 209 in California and I-200 in the state of Washington. And if you don't know much about those, they have changed the landscape of what colleges and universities, public institutions look like in California and Washington. California universities had a dramatic drop in the enrollment of Latinos and Blacks in university campuses statewide, at the same time when their high school population has a much larger percentage of Latinos and Blacks. And so it is very, very worrisome. So I want to end with that and look forward to the conversation.
We know that whenever certain issues are placed on the ballot, that they tend to not be ones that promote civil rights, but may go the other way. In, for example, the Michigan initiative or the Proposition 209 in California. What do you think, from a political standpoint, should be done to deal with that issue going forward? I certainly take Professor Thompson's point that having voting rights alone isn't enough if the economics don't match. I've heard our other two speakers and their ideas, but I wondered if you could look at a current political strategy and give us your thoughts.
I'll speak briefly to Proposition 2. I think one way, what Proposition 2 and what the effort has been in terms of an anti-civil rights move in using ballot initiatives is to put language that seems really innocuous, right? So like Proposition 2 reads that, that we want to prohibit discrimination and preferences based on race, color, ethnicity, and gender. Now if you read that, if I read that, I would think, hey, it's not a bad idea, right? But it is, so the language is innocuous, the intent is quite different. And I think the way in which, the only way I think in which to politically counter that beyond, sort of active public education efforts, which was a 3-year-long effort in Michigan, is to put alternative ballot language. And I think it sounds like a strange, but I think in a lot of ways it's to put forth on ballots in the same way positive language that actually promotes civil rights meaningfully as an alternative, because otherwise you're engaged in an effort which I think is incredibly difficult at trying to educate people about what intent, what the intent of these measures is. That is a very, very narrow answer to your question, but one that I think is pertinent to what just happened to you 2 days ago.
Want to say anything, Phil?
Well, I would suggest that black communities have to fund their own movements and fund their own organizations. About 10 years ago, I counted 600 nonprofits in Harlem, and there had been far fewer than that a decade before, and political participation in Harlem had been going down. And that's because these organizations, they are scared to do voter registration. They're scared that they will get cut off from funding from foundations, or they're scared that politicians will cut them off from government funding because elected officials don't like voter registration, believe it or not. Why? Because they're already elected. And the new people, they don't know who they're going to vote for. So and you compare that with other institutions that are self-financed, like labor unions, take 1199. They give a huge amount of money to DeVal Patrick. They do whatever they want. I don't always agree with what they do, but the point is they do political mobilization. And it's directly because they are self-financed. They have a way of, they're economically independent, so they're politically independent. So I think that's a big part of the problem.
My comment recognizes there are two levels of response to this question. One is the tactical response, and I agree with what both of you have said. I think careful wording is important. I think political organization is important. But the other level of response acknowledges candidly we have a terrible attitudinal problem in this country. There's deep-seated prejudice against minorities of color. I tried in the writing of Waiting Gautreaux to figure out where that came from. I gave up after I was reading about the Portuguese sailors who, as far back as the 1400s, were bringing black Africans from sub-Saharan Africa to Iberia and selling them as slaves to the white Christians in the Iberian Peninsula. We have a world history, not just an American history, of the denigration of people of color, blacks particularly, the association of black skin with servitude. And we've worsened it in this country with our own national history, which don't have to recount. I think a part of our problem, not the whole of it, because I'm in agreement with you on the present-day tactical efforts that need to be part of the response. But a part of our problem also should be to attempt over the long run, no magic bullet, not overnight, to deal with the underlying attitudinal problem. Demography is on our side for the long run. We are going to be a nation of minorities, if you will, eventually, and that's going to help. But meanwhile, we've got the white power structure has its own serious problem. You were absolutely right in a different way than I think you meant it when you said the problem isn't with black people, the problem is white people. It's really what I'm trying to say here in a slightly different way. To deal with that white attitudinal problem, I came to the conclusion a part, I think a big part, but certainly a part of the problem stems from what's been generated by a century-long confinement of African Americans to ghettos, as evidenced by our war on drugs. And how do we deal with that problem? How do we get at the roots of it?
Well, let's hear
Over the long run, the answer that I think I want to propose is that we've got to face up to our African American ghetto problem and begin to dismantle that ghetto.
Okay, we have a question.
Hi, I'm Sashi. I'm a MPA student here. And this is in response to Dr. Thompson. I really want to thank you for your comment about white people and institutions and their absolute being a part of why the ghetto exists and that problem. It really reminded me of kind of a big aha moment for me in my undergraduate experience reading Derek Bell's Space Traders article. And it's just something that I unfortunately don't hear talked about enough as honestly as you were. So my question then is to you, in Professor Jarvis's class, we're talking about media in terms of all of this and looking at media not just as Fox News or other mainstream sources, but the textbook industry, and even thinking about, I think about even college and university courses, including those taught at Baruch, which have an absence of the kind of language you were talking about and reality you're talking about. So the question is, do you see that already becoming part of our discourse and structure for looking at these problems? And if not, how do you hopefully see that as becoming part of it?
I'll be quick. There's a lot of good literature, I think, recently dealing with, race and history, great literature. How to popularize it, I'm not sure. I think that's a challenge right now. But one of the things I haven't seen in the literature is, where did he come from? Where did he come from? Where did Marion come from? I mean, we don't know where white anti-racist activists come from. A lot of my heroes are white anti-racists, but going back to John Brown. But I don't know what was the process in their lives, what happened to get them where they are. I actually think that is a critical question in building solidarity and integrating and all of that in this country. And that I haven't seen in the literature. And that is something, I know one person in academia who's focused on that issue. He hasn't been able to get any funding in 2 years. His name is Mark Warren. He's at Harvard University. He's fixated on this question, can't get any juice from anybody.
Can I comment on that question very briefly? I can't tell you where Marianne came from or where I came from, but I don't think either of us is the answer. It's for the reason you said. Yes, there may be some pension funds that blacks could control and Latinos, if they got their act together, and in isolated places they could do a redevelopment job with affordable housing, and that would be great. I'd be all for it. But in the big picture, query, you said it all, and I agree with you. The black middle class is middle class by income. It's not middle class by accumulated wealth. It's fighting with its fingernails, just barely hanging on to retain its middle class status in this kind of economy we've got. I do not believe we can look to the black middle class to solve this problem, because it's going to take a couple more generations before hopefully they accumulate the kind of wealth that they need. So if the answer isn't isolated individuals like Marianne and myself, and if the answer isn't the black middle class, what is the answer? Answer, I think, in part, if you got it, go ahead. The answer, in part, is to deal with one of the underlying causes about why we act the way we do. Why did we do what we did after World War II when we cut blacks, including returning servicemen who had put their lives on the line, out of the middle classification of America that went on in the 2 decades immediately following World War II? Why did we do that? Why do we do what we do today with the incarceration of young black males? I do not believe we are going to get the answers to those questions until we are willing to plunge deeply into our attitudinal situation and deal with the attitudes. And when we do that, I think at the bottom, the black ghetto is going to be one of the attitudinal sources.
I want to add something really quickly to that. I think it has a lot to do with the students who are attending colleges and universities today. You know, you should ask for those classes, ask for those professors, ask for people to be able to do research in those areas. You know, I will do everything I can to make sure that people have access to colleges and universities, but demands for that type of work and resources in college and universities, I think, is one of our best hopes to try to transform the way in which people think about these issues. I think for me, my opening of my eyes came in growing up in Chicago in the Chicago Public Schools, but it came just as much in college. And if I didn't have those kind of experiences, and I think if we don't continue to press to have these kinds of events and these kinds of opportunities, we're not going to be able to have the kind of conversations we're having. So I think it's as much on you as it is on any of us, and I really hope that you'll continue to push for that here and in places you go going forward.
I would like to ask you to thank our wonderful panel for their time tonight. These topics are always difficult, but when you have experts and people who spend their lives trying to explain the difficult, it makes it easier for us. I'd also like to acknowledge the assistance of Angelina Delgado and Nafiza Uden tonight in helping us put this together. And finally, to my graduate assistant for the last 2 years, Rusadan Tietea, who has been absolutely wonderful in helping to promote the ideals of the Ackerman Lecture series, as well as the Center for Equality, Pluralism, and Policy. Thank you, Rusadan. And to the rest of the audience, one of the most diverse in the nation, but in order to take advantage of this diversity, you have to talk to one another. And however we can help you do that, please let us know. We would love to work with you on that. We have leadership at the top, but we need to see more leadership from you. And I'm challenging you now to start that dialogue and to continue it, and to use us in any way we can help you do that. Thank you, and good night.
I enjoyed